we can get back on track and make it into the 20th century by the end of the semester. It seems like we're just mired here. Uh, and that's probably in part because I'm no big fan of the Italian Renaissance. I like the northern stuff, but not this stuff so much. But the long and the short of it is that on the exam, we're probably not going to get to mannerism. I'm pretty sure there's not going to have time in 2 more classes after this one to get through mannerism. So as you're beginning to study over the weekend, you can certainly skip that part. And then we'll know further what comes off the Northern Ren section, because that'll be the next part that we do after this will be Northern Renaissance. Okay, so we go back up to Germany and the Low Countries. Okay, so we were talking in class on Tuesday about this amazing moment in Florence in the early 1500s when Leonardo's working on the Mona Lisa at the same time that Michelangelo's working on the David, 2 of the most famous works in the entire history of art being produced at the same time in the same city, which is a pretty amazing sort of moment. Michelangelo's David was originally commissioned by the city of Florence, and the original plan for the David was to put it on top of the cathedral, adorning one of the buttresses of one of the side domes of the cathedral, sort of looking out this avenue that you see here. And a reproduction was put there for a while back in the early 2000s, so people could see what it originally looked like. And the city decided that Michelangelo had done too darned good a job to leave it in such a relatively obscure place, right? So as soon as it was finished, they decided they should move it instead, and it wound up in front of the city hall in Florence, the main entrance to the city hall. Which, remember that David was a symbol for Florence, right? It was their figure, like not patron saint, because he's not a saint, right? But that basic idea. He was their analogy, and that became a good place for it. It's now in a museum, and a copy is there to this day, right? A replica remains in the place where they had put it. And they moved it to a museum for obvious reasons, right? In fact, at some point, somebody chucked a bench at him, and you can see on his left wrist, his proper left wrist on your right, you can see a crack, sort of just here, where it's been put back together again, Humpty Dumpty style, right? After having been damaged by a vandal. The fact that it was meant to be seen 60 feet off of the ground is why he's so darn big, right? And it's hard to get a sense of scale when we look at him isolated like we see on the left. But with our team of experts during a study investigation of Michelangelo's David, gives you a sense of scale that basically if you were to stand down, on the same plinth that he's on, you'd basically come up to his kneecaps, right? So just, and this is typical for Leonardo, actually for Michelangelo, kind of thing that sets him apart from Leonardo. When we talked about Leonardo, we talked about how he liked to mesh the figure with the surroundings and sort of meld the differences between one to the other using sfumato, and things just sort of fade into the background, and how much the landscape was really part of how he envisions the human figure as being part of nature, right? And sort of melding with it. And for Michelangelo, he sees his figures as being larger than life, quite literally. But he sees them looming over the landscape. Our landscape doesn't really matter for him. That in all of Michelangelo's works, it is the human form that is the single most important thing and the bearer of all meaning in his work. Unlike Leonardo, who really likes using landscape and natural details to enhance meaning, right? It's an interesting comparison, albeit an unfair one, because again, Donatello's David is life-size, which means if you put him next to him, he's about the size of his shin, right? But here we see them at exactly the same size, and you can see that. I also like how Michelangelo's is looking at Donatello's up here on the screen. But the bottom line is that Michelangelo was looking at Donatello as well. He loved Donatello. Donatello, dozens of sculptures available in public places in Florence. And Michelangelo, as a young sculptor, knew Donatello's work and idolized Donatello in a lot of ways that we can find. And if we had more time, we would sort of go into that much more firmly. But you can see looking at them side by side, that they have basically the same pose, which is eventually derived from the old Roman Greek contrapposto pose, where one leg bears the weight, the other leg relaxes, right? And if you look at them from waist down, you can see an amazing similarity of poses, right? One arm relaxed on the same side as the flexed leg, right? In this case, Donatello's holding the sword, Michelangelo's down by his calf. The other arm bent, flexed on the same side as the relaxed leg, right? And this is not just by chance, right? This is, in fact, by design. It's all the more amazing, Michelangelo's David, is that this commission had originally gone to another artist in the 1460s. And the city had selected the marble and had it already chosen out. And that guy had begun to sort of bang at it a bit and then stopped, right? And so when they gave the commission to Michelangelo, he had this piece of marble that he didn't get to choose. He liked to go choose his own marble. And he had this other piece that somebody else already started to whack at a bit. And somewhere inside of that, he found this, right? Found this figure. Okay. Looking at it side by side, other than the scale differences and other than the differences in a medium, marble versus cast bronze, right? What are some other striking differences between our Davids here? Age. And how do you mean that, Julia?
Well, it's obviously a boy.
A boy, right?
14-ish, and that's a dude. Looks 25-ish.
Okay, so the body, and what makes him look 25-ish?
He's got more developed muscles. He looks like his facial features are more
Mature looking, at least, yeah.
He's got the cheeks and
Okay.
The gangly.
Right. It's primarily the muscles, though, isn't it? Really, the big thing, right? That we talked a lot about Donatello's musculature being pubescent, right? Being soft and underdeveloped, and there's certainly nothing underdeveloped about Michelangelo's, right? Whoever looks like that, honestly, I mean, it's so perfect in its proportions and in its understanding of musculature. It's soft enough, right? Slightly. It's not nearly as chiseled and hard-edged as some of those Greek sculptures might have looked, right? But it certainly is adult musculature, right? That adds to the sense that he's a fully developed adult. But what's kind of fascinating about that is he adds the idea of youth in a slightly different way. Look at the size of his hand, right? I always like to compare Michelangelo's David to like a Labrador puppy dog, with the great big paws that he's going to grow still. So even at 14 feet tall, there's the sense that he's not done growing yet. And what Michelangelo's getting across is that there is this sort of, he sees this perfection and ideal, even in youth, right? That doesn't matter. What he's using David as an excuse is to give us this absolutely perfect body, right? What else do we see that's different about the two? So the musculature is certainly part of that. Yeah, Anna.
The feeling of Donatello David, he's not really he doesn't feel strong. What we were talking about,
like this one's got confidence in a way, doesn't it? Right? Sort of determination, right? He's just kind of drawing a bead on Goliath, right? And he has this sense of strong determination. And Donatello's David remains kind of aloof. Abby in the back.
To piggyback off of that, I feel like their stance also. So, like Michelangelo's, he looks very stoic almost, and Donatello's, he's kind of like.
Yeah, right. That aloofness, right, and versus determination. We'll come back to them, but yeah, that sort of look, right, that scowl, if you will. Michelangelo loved. He had this term for it, the sort of inner anxiety of the soul was something that he was very much interested in, sort of the troubled nature of being human, right? And often is working with the theme of the soul trying to emerge from the body somehow, sort of trapped, right? It's hard to imagine anybody feeling trapped in that body, but you get the soul wants to be, and that idea of the sort of fierce anxiety of the soul comes out in this sort of firm determination.
Could it also be that wasn't the Donatello the one that you said that he went out of his way to make him look weak? So because the point was that God was really the one who
Right.
was God to accomplish.
Right.
And so that is more that historical context of more religious piece and this reference to. And
Oh, that's an interesting idea. So this idea of the God working through Donatello's.
It wasn't at the piece.
Yeah, that was the one we talked about. And I think that's kind of, I hadn't thought about it that way. But yeah, Michelangelo doesn't need God's help, right? He doesn't need anybody's help, except maybe a good clothier. But even at that, right, doesn't need anybody's help. And that kind of points to another issue, right? I think there still is this idea of relying on a higher power, because you'll notice he doesn't have anything. It doesn't have the shin guards, right? He doesn't have the helmet in Michelangelo's, right? We've lost the last vestiges of military armor, right? And that kind of makes Donatello's David a bit more erotic in a way, because the fact that he's got chaps, and a hat makes him not really nude, but naked. If we can distinguish between the two. Nudes, right? A nude statue, there's no sort of impropriety to that, right? They sort of belong nude, And Donatello's is kind of naked, right? So I think that ties into what you're saying there, right? That they're really, and what Julia was saying as well, that there's not the sense of the need for God's intervention here in the same way, right? That he's more self-reliant, as Abby was saying in the back, right? So that nakedness is kind of a big issue here, right? And what's interesting about what happens with Michelangelo is when he abandons these little details, right? There's no head of Goliath underfoot. With Donatello's, it's a particular point in the story, right? He has thrown the rock and has cut off the head. But there's really nothing in the Michelangelo to suggest what part of the story this is. It's timeless, which adds to that sense of perfection and maybe even adds to the sense of being nude versus naked, right? This is something that doesn't exist in normal time or in the normal world. He could be sizing up Goliath. He could have already thrown the stone and thinking about what he's got to do next. He could just be hearing Goliath and the troops coming, and they're looking over the hill to see if they're there. Right? There's not something there that tells us exactly when it is. There's no real action happening yet, or even have happened, or any allusion to it, right? It's this potential to do stuff without actually doing it, right? So that really sets it apart. It becomes this more idealized image of the potential strength of man, right? And as I mentioned at the beginning of class, one of the things Michelangelo is very much interested in is the human body as the bearer of meaning, right? And the ability of we humans, this is humanism in a nutshell, right? That we can do anything, that all things are measured based on human existence, right? Man is the measure of all things. Right? So one of the great things ever done, fantastic. If you ever have a chance to see it, it's well worth the trip. Unlike the Mona Lisa, which is a wash, right? This is big enough that you can see it in a crowd. In 1508, he was summoned by the Pope to leave Florence behind. It was primarily the fame of the David that did this. And Pope Julius II, the popes had moved back to Rome by this point. They moved back to Rome in the 1430s, 1440s, right? From Avignon, which is kind of where we left them. And only by the end of the 15th century do the popes become major patrons of the arts. This is why the Renaissance kind of starts in Florence instead of starting in Rome, as the popes aren't there to get it going, right? And when they come back, they adopt Renaissance as their style. And in 1505, Julius II summoned Michelangelo to come work for him in Rome. And remember that Michelangelo is a testy fellow. He's not particularly likable. He and the Pope have, modern parlance, they're frenemies, right? They get along well enough, but they kind of are angry at each other all the time. the Charlton Heston movie where Charlton Heston played Michelangelo kind of overblows that a bit. But they had difficulties. And what Julius wants from Michelangelo is to create for him a massive tomb to go into St. Peter's. This is where the popes will all be buried, is under the floor of St. Peter's in the crypt. Right? And he wants a tomb to outdo everybody's. And so he hires Michelangelo specifically to work on his tomb. And the tomb is going to have something like 35 life-size figures on it. Right? And Michelangelo's the man for the job, he thinks, to not only design the tomb itself, the structure, but also to carve all of the figures. And it's meant to show the soul of Julius, which is up above, being born by angels, ascending from earth down below through knowledge to the heavens, right? And Michelangelo doesn't get very far. Keeps going back to the project over decades and decades, and never really finishes it. And part of the reason is that Julius keeps shooting him to other projects. But part of it is also this Neoplatonic interest in leaving things incomplete, right? We talked about Leonardo, how he never finished stuff, right? We also talked about how he used sfumato so that you would complete things in your mind, and that made it more perfect, right? Well, when Michelangelo leaves a figure like this, kind of emerging from the block of stone, there's that same sort of, it's like sfumato in marble, you know? You start to imagine it coming out, and you imagine what it would look like if it were completed, and that imagining completes it in your mind where it stays ideal. And we think that Michelangelo often left these because he was kind of pleased with how it looks there, you know? And granted, he probably would have gone back and finished if he had the chance, but there was something that he also found at this particular point, there's something rather pleasant about it. He wrote about sculpture, how he made sculptures, that he would take the block, and he said he could see in any block of marble, he could imagine the figure inside the block. And his job as a sculptor was to get rid of the stuff that was in the way of having that figure emerge from the marble. So he felt that all he was doing was sort of trimming, like a butcher trimming the fat off of a leg of lamb or something, right? Getting it down to where it's got the useful stuff inside. And he said that the way that he sculpted, the way that he sculpted was to work from the front back, and that the figure was inside the block like a bather in a bathtub full of water, like underwater. And his job as a sculptor was to pull the plug, and as the water received, the human figure would appear, and that's kind of how it worked, was from one side back, because the majority of these sculptures are meant to be seen up against something, right? So you work from the principal viewpoint. And that was true for the David as well. That's why you never see him from the back. He's got a perfect body, but it looks so great from the back, right? Go find pictures. Don't take my word for it. So Julius has got big plans, right? Monster plans for Michelangelo. He wants him to work on the tomb. Julius eventually dies in 1513. Michelangelo continues to work on it even after Julius's death, right? Does a couple sculptures right away for it. They never get really incorporated in it. He doesn't finish it until the 1540s, like 30 years after Julius is dead, is he finally done with the tomb, which is in a different church. It's in the parish church that Julius had been a priest at prior to becoming pope, San Pietro in Vincoli, which you can visit in Rome. And it's dominated by an early figure of Moses, where you can see he's still got the horns on his head, just like Klaus Schluter's did in the center bottom. Right? So this occupied some of Michelangelo's time over the years, and it was the original reason that he came to Rome was to work on the tomb for Julius. And it never really gets done. Julius doesn't live to see it completed, right? I don't know where Julius was buried in the meantime, right? Before the tomb was completed. Now, Julius had other plans as well. One of the things that Julius is doing, right, again, he's like 3 generations of popes after they've come back to Rome, is he's actually trying to rebuild the city and institute Rome as being sort of what we think about today, which is this great Renaissance city, right? And he's got really, really big plans. And one of his biggest plans is to tear down the church that marked the grave of St. Peter, right? And this is a fairly ostentatious plan because it's one of the first official Christian buildings ever made. And it was originally built by Constantine the Great around 300, 320 AD. So there's a 1,000-year-old church there in Rome that's built directly over the graveyard where St. Peter was buried and houses his body, the body of St. Peter. Right? And you can see it. You can go there. I saw his finger when I was in Rome. Right? You go on a crypt tour. And they're pretty sure, the people, the archaeology proof of it actually being St. Peter is pretty good, actually. Fairly good proof of it. So you go on a crypt tour, you can see it. Right? Constantine built this church originally, right? Back in 300. And Julius decided it's too darn small to reflect the glory of the papacy. So he tears it down, which is incredible that he would think of even doing this. 1,000 years old, built by the first Roman emperor who embraced Christianity. Right? A monument to the history of the empire and the church. Not big enough for me, right? He could live in Arlington County, right? Around here. My wife and I have these jokes that there are two mantras to living in 22207. One is tear it down, right? Not big enough, right? And then must get ahead if you're driving. Those are sort of the three mantras of living in this area, right? Getting passed on the right. But also all these things that you see, flip this house, tear it down, and fill the entire lot with house. Well, that's what Julius is going to do, right? And you can see with the cars down below exactly how monstrous this thing is. And he's got plans. Michelangelo doesn't work on it at first. He works on it for a later pope. But eventually supplies the dome, as well as some of the sculptural details around the outside here at the bottom are designed by Michelangelo later, right? But this monster project, and here it gives you a sense, right? That little bit in the bottom, this is a drawing, right, of the incomplete St. Peter's while it was being constructed. And the bit at the bottom with the pointy roof, that's the old St. Peter's, right? That's the one that was built by Constantine, which at the time was a pretty massive church because it was meant to incorporate all the pilgrims that were coming to see the grave of St. Peter. Right? Very, very large thing. And also meant to proclaim the new relationship between the emperor and the church. And that was simply not big enough, and it gives you a sense of the scale of what Julius is doing, right? Literally twice as tall, making this monster work. So Julius has got really big plans, right? Michelangelo is part of those plans. So he wants him first to work on the tomb. Michelangelo does it for a couple of years, gets some sculptures finished for it, right? Some other ones left unfinished from that. And then it's Julius himself who yanks Michelangelo off of the project. He doesn't stop. And it may be that he figured out that Michelangelo's never going to finish the thing based on the original plan, but it's also that he's got something else he wants Michelangelo to do, something he thinks he can complete. And that's the Sistine Chapel, right? The famous frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Now, Michelangelo is only responsible for the things from the top of the windows up, right? From this level here is Michelangelo. Because part of it below, this part down below, was decorated earlier, right? The chapel was originally built by Pope Sixtus IV, right around 1460, 1470. Right? And that's why we call it the Sistine Chapel. Sistine means the chapel of Sixtus, right? So it's named after the person who originally had it built. And when Sixtus built it, the whole point, if you've not been, is that this is where the Pope receives Mass, right? Where he receives communion, okay? So it's the Pope's private chapel, if you will. Doesn't feel like that now because if you ever go, it's just packed, right? And they shush you and they don't let you take photographs, right? You're not supposed to talk or take photographs. People are always doing it, and you can't get good ones anyway. It's too crowded, right? So when it was first built and when it was first decorated, Sixtus hired the best artists of the day to decorate the walls down below. Ceiling was not finished yet, right? Or it was finished, but it wasn't decorated. We think there might have just been some stars up there, like a starry sky. But down below, he hired the best artists from the 15th century to decorate the walls. These included Botticelli, right, who we looked at. Came from Florence to Rome to work on the Sistine Chapel in the 1480s, right? So I think this one's Botticelli here, right? So there are 10 scenes down below showing Moses on one side and the life of St. Peter on the other, which would make sense for the Pope. Right? But there was nothing much up above. And then Julius hires Michelangelo to fresco the ceiling, right, to decorate the ceiling. So it's the second phase of work in the Sistine Chapel, right? 30 plus years after the original. And it shows a series of images that focus on 9 central scenes in the middle. So on the sides, on the walls, and up above, we have ancestors of Christ in those lunettes, those half donuts, right? And in the triangles above them. Those are Christ's ancestors. And in between those triangles, seated on the thrones, those big muscular figures are all prophets who foretold the coming of Christ. And the fact that we have Christ's ancestors and prophets who talk about Christ coming would make you think that the middle would be all about Jesus, but it's not. In fact, Christ probably doesn't appear here, at least not obviously so. What the center shows us, the bit in the middle, the focal part, is the creation of the world in 6 different scenes, leading up to the creation of Adam, and from him the creation of Eve. And then in 3 more scenes, the fall of man, original sin, and its consequences. Right? So what the ceiling shows us is the need for Christ. And think about the Ghent altarpiece, right? Where we opened up the Ghent altarpiece and there were Adam and Eve surrounding this big image of the Mass in heaven with all saints. We're reminded of why we need salvation, why we need to take communion, right? Is because of the original sin. So here is the actual sin itself, Adam and Eve on the left. Michelangelo, his women still look like men, right? Or maybe, I don't know, Soviet wrestlers or something like that, right? Certainly looks steroided anyway. In 2 scenes, Adam and Eve taking the apple from the serpent and then being kicked out of heaven. Notice that Eve in both of these, whether she's huddled and cowering on the right or on the left taking the apple, is a redhead. Keep that in the back of your mind because we'll see her later, right? But she's depicted with red hair. Was that your hand, Abigail, or were you just... You're silhouetted against the back, right? So this is sort of our, we're getting toward the end of, or the beginning of the last 4 scenes. So we got 5 scenes of the creation, and then we got 4 scenes of the fall of man, right? And so as we read up to the left or to the top, we will then see the outcome of the sin of Adam and Eve, right? Where does that lead us? And it eventually culminates in the very last scene, which is Noah after the flood, being seen drunk by his children, right? The flood purges sin from the earth, but it doesn't, right? We're still bad. And Noah, after the flood, gets drunk and his kids see him naked, right? So it begins with creation, ends with sin. And that tells us why then we need salvation, right? And what's interesting about Noah here, right, being seen naked by his children, is the way in which his body is exactly the same body as Jesus's, or as Christ. Long. Thank you. Him. No, not David. Adam. We're all messed up, right? Basically the same pose as Adam, which is theologically kind of the message, right? That the creation of man is the whole point. This is all part of the plan, right? That mankind will sin. This is predestined, if you will. And that what starts with Adam will lead to Noah. And Michelangelo uses the composition to show us that, right? Now, this is obviously the most famous scene in the entire, right, sequence. It's the fourth one up. What's interesting is the fifth one, the centerpiece, is the creation of Eve out of Adam. It's all her fault. It's always women's fault in a patriarchal society, right? Blame the woman. Way before Me Too. So here's God coming down from heaven, surrounded by the heavenly host, and energizing Adam, right? Adam is, you'll notice the degree to which the landscape doesn't matter. The degree to which it's all about the human figure, right? And Adam, again, hyper-muscular, right? Really incredible forearm, bicep on him, right? He doesn't need anybody's help either, but he's getting it from God, who reaches down and through his touch raises Adam from the earth, right? Remember, he formed him from the earth, so the Bible says, and now he's animating that, giving him a breath of life. Adam's name in Hebrew simply means earth as well, right? So, but Michelangelo downplays any kind of landscape setting, right? There really is very little there because the whole story is being told through human figures. And indeed, if we look at Adam and God, you'll see that there's a certain similarity to their poses as well, a sort of reflective symbiosis between the two, that he is a creation of God. Some people have suggested that the thing around God, the bolt of fabric and the figures, looks like the cross-section of a brain, which is sort of fascinating, right? I don't know if that's intentional or not, or a lucky accident, right? But the idea for Neoplatonists that perfection is in the mind could kind of make some sense there, you know, that he sees the creation of man and the sort of the setting in motion of all things in human history as being something that comes out of the mind of God, right? I haven't seen sort of enough proof to suggest that maybe it's intentional if it's just lucky, right? I kind of like it though. So there's Adam, and the painting's been recently cleaned, and by recently in my scheme of things, in the last 25 years or so, it's been cleaned. And we find that Michelangelo is much better as a colorist than we ever thought. The colors are much more rich and vibrant, so you can read them from the ground, right? But there's that wonderful touch of God's muscular and aged hand about to touch the finger of Adam. What's interesting about this touch and bringing this in as part of our discussion is you'll notice that with God's right hand, he almost touches the hand of Adam. And then we trace his anatomy, we follow the arm up, that amazing bicep, across his shoulders, and we go to his other arm, right, his left arm. And you see it goes behind the neck of a woman, and then it touches a baby. What's it pointing at? That little baby, right? So the question is, who are these people behind him? And some people have suggested that maybe that's Eve, because she's got red hair. And the next scene, we see the creation of Eve. So the idea is here, this is all part of the plan, right? He knows he's going to create Eve next, so he's bringing her along for the ride, right? And this will lead us into the next scene where he forms her out of the body of Adam. But other people suggested that maybe it's the Virgin Mary. And that the little baby then is Jesus. Because you'll notice that he's pointing right here. Adam's apple. Right? And that, as we've talked about before when we looked at the Filippo Lippi picture, right? Christ is the new Adam in theological writings. Right? And God's making the connection between the two of them with his hands. Pointing at one, pointing at the other. So that seems to me that that's definitely meant to be Jesus. The question is whether or not that's Mary. The fact that she's topless makes it a little problematic. Right? That seems much more likely for Eve. Right? But still sort of fascinating picture, right? There's more going on than you might imagine. Now, Michelangelo lives for another 55 years after this. Really long career. I think he dies in 64, right? And his style undergoes a lot of changes over that time. And we'll get to that when we talk about mannerism, late Michelangelo, right? But here we see him sort of at the height of his career, working for Pope Julius II, just prior to Julius's death in 1513. Now, in this moment when Michelangelo and Leonardo are both working in Florence, another guy comes to town, Raphael. They're all three working in Florence at exactly the same time, right? And Raphael comes from a town in northern Italy, immigrates to Florence after having trained under painters in northern Italy, and arrives in Florence as a relatively young artist. He's early 20s, right? Like 23 or something when he gets there. And setting up shop in Florence, he begins to paint for the open market a series of devotional pictures of the Madonna and Child. It's a cute little baby, isn't it? I think. Pudgy little head and toe head, right? And he arrives, 1505, and he arrives at exactly the moment when Michelangelo leaves, right? They may have overlapped by a month or something is all, right? But pretty much as soon as Raphael gets there, Michelangelo gets this summons from the Pope to go to Rome, which means that while Raphael is working in Florence, the primary influence is Leonardo, right? And Raphael spends the next 3 years there, while Leonardo's still there as well. And as we look at his pictures, we can see, yeah, there's kind of a Leonardo sense to this. Look at the diaphanous veil wrapped around her neck. Nowhere near as complex, nowhere near as sophisticated. I always think that Raphael's kind of like Leonardo light. You know, he's cleaned it up. He's gotten rid of the mystery. The air is sort of crystalline and clear. You know, you can see things there. There's nothing hiding from you. Little of it's left for you to complete in your mind, right? It's really cleanly painted. And that's typical for Raphael's work, right? Very accessible, very obvious. And I kind of like Raphael, but one of the things about his career is that he's a bit of a sponge in that he picks up influences kind of quickly and immediately, depending on who's working around him. So our Madonna on the right is one of, I think, roughly 17 that he did, at least that survive today, right? There probably were more. During this 3-year span where he's working in Florence after first arriving there, right? Here's another one from a different collection. But you can see with all of these that there's sort of a Leonardo sense that's been sort of tidied up, spotlit for you, right? An interest in the way things kind of weave together, but never as mysterious as Leonardo's are, right? These are often named after owners. Cardellino Madonna, after the Cardellino family, and the Cowper Madonna. The Cowper family owned 2 of these, so this is the smaller one, right? But made these, like I said, for the open market while working in Florence. In 1508, he also gets a summons from the Pope. Julius has got more work than than Michelangelo can do, right? And 1508 is before Michelangelo even starts on the Sistine ceiling. But he realizes, Julius does, with all the things he wants to do in Rome, he needs all the talent he can get, right? So he sends a message to Raphael as well. Please come to Rome and work for me. And, you know, when the Pope asks you, you don't say no, right? There's only one answer to that. It's the Pope, right? And these are believers. They're not going to say no, right? So the Pope asks Raphael to come, and he comes to work for Julius as well. And he continues, in addition to the work he does for Julius, which we'll look at, he continues to do these devotional pictures for private clients, right? So the Alba Madonna, again named after an earlier owner, is another of these devotional images of the Madonna and Child. And it's fairly large if you've seen it. It's about like yay, right? Good 3.5, 4 feet across, right? And so the Madonna is sitting here. The one on the right, she's in a little on a parapet, maybe a reference to the walled garden that we saw before, the Virgin as the enclosed garden. Right? Here we see her sitting directly on the ground, and she's sort of leaning back on a stump or maybe a small rise of rocks behind her elbow. But putting her directly on the earth makes her very humble in character, emphasizes her humility instead of her greatness in heaven, right? And she's been reading again, which is a sort of a standard Renaissance theme, taking a second out now. And instead of being bothered by some angel, some dude coming into her room while she's reading, right? She's taking a moment to sort of be a mom, right? And she's got baby Jesus on her lap. Yeah. Who's the third kid, or the second kid, the third figure? Say that louder. John the what?
Baptist.
The Baptist, exactly right. John the Baptist. Not John the Evangelist, right? But John the Baptist. Remember, there are two St. Johns, which you saw on the Ghent altar, right? John the Baptist. Now, how do you know he's John the Baptist? Brittany, how'd you know that?
The worksheet.
Oh, it's on the worksheet. Oh, there you go. See, I don't remember what I put on those things. John the Baptist. So it's John the Baptist on the left. Okay. Now, we can tell John the Baptist from a couple of different things. One is, I might have a detail of this coming up. He's wearing a fur coat. And that's John the Baptist standard clothing. Now, it's not meant to be riches. It's what we call a hair coat. And what it is, it's a fur coat turned with the barb. So when you take a fur with the skin on it, and the fur is on this side, the other side has the ends of the hair follicles, right? And it's actually really scratchy, right? And so when you turn the fur this way, it's kind of nice because you get the fuzzy part, right? But if you turn it the other way, you get the bases of all of the hair follicles, and that is irritating. It's like a virgin wool shirt, right? It's just scratchy. And when John the Baptist, as an adult, decides to turn his back on the world and go off into the desert to pray, he wears a hair shirt, right, which is the fur on the outside, to never be comfortable in the physical world, never be comfortable in the flesh, to always remind himself that there's something more than physical comfort in this world, right? So just be naturally uncomfortable. We still got it on here, right? So that's a reference to help us identify him, right? Also, when we see the Baptist as an infant, we almost always see him with that cross as well, a little fashioned cross, because he's the last prophet to identify Christ, right? Behold the Lamb of God, okay? When he sees him at the River Jordan. Now, what's interesting about these two side by side is in the intervening 5 years, Raphael's gone from being very much influenced by Leonardo while he's in Florence to being very much influenced by Michelangelo now that he's in Rome. Because remember that Michelangelo had left Florence for Rome about the exact same time that Raphael had arrived. And our figure of the Alba Madonna looks very much like some of the prophets that are appearing on the Sistine ceiling. And there's a story about Raphael sort of sneaking into the Sistine while Michelangelo was working at night to see what he was up to, right? He was so curious as to what this sculptor was painting. And you can see, I think, if you look at the range of the sort of monumental scale of the figure and the sort of burly anatomy, even beneath the clothing, the degree to which he's been looking at these androgynous figures by Michelangelo that are incredibly muscular men and women, right, and adopting those into his piece. Okay, come on. Respond. There we go. So there's the Baptist with his hair shirt, tiniest of halos. Jesus now, if we look at the picture, you'll notice that it's really kind of a subtle but important moment. It's not just the Madonna and child and the Baptist, but something's going on here. And it looks as if Jesus has been sort of resting on her lap. See his hand back there as well. And what he's doing is he's pushing himself away from her. And he's taking his first steps out. Right? Now, remember what blue means for the Virgin Mary. It's a sign of fidelity, faithfulness to his cause, right? And red, of course, is a symbol of her feelings, of her emotions, of her passion. Right? Well, Christ is leaving that safety and stepping out into the world. And as he does, he reaches over and he grabs that cross. that John the Baptist is holding. And this is a sign of him acknowledging, even as an infant, that he knows what his fate is. And she does as well. And she looks over and she looks directly at the cross. Right? And is focused on that. And it's this moment of kind of a poignant moment of revelation for her. That's right. That's why he's here. I've got to let him go as he moves out into the world to accept his fate. Right? And this is the sort of thing that someone would ponder in looking at the work. One last little thing. The shape, right? The elephant in the room, the shape of this picture being unlike anything else we've looked at. Round. In Florence and in much of Italy, it was fairly common at the birth of an infant to give gifts. And one of the most common gifts that people gave was a silver platter. Right? They called it a tondo that you would give. Right? And during the 15th century, this idea of giving a platter to someone as a gift for the birth of a child was augmented with the idea of giving a round painting instead. Right? An elaboration of the idea of the birth tondo. Right? Give a painted version of that instead. And we find often that the round paintings that we have relate to themes that have to do with infancy, childhood. Right? And so this image of Jesus stepping off of the lap of the Virgin and taking his first steps on his own, and the mother's acceptance of the knowledge of the danger and acceptance of the fate is a kind of a nice image for a new mother as well. Now, one hopes that not every mother thinks their child's going to get tortured to death, but nonetheless, this idea of what it means to be a parent, to protect when they're young and allow them to grow up, proceed on their own path, right? And that's exactly the sort of message that Raphael projects here.
Am I imagining that the landscape in this Madonna looks much more Da Vinci-esque than the previous work that you showed of his?
Hang on, I'm trying to go. It's back on my screen. This is responding slowly. Hang on a second. There. That one. It's a little hazier, but I think it's still a long way from Leonardo.
No,
You know?
but it seems like what you're saying about him being a sponge and being influenced
Yeah.
by who he's around. This one, if you told me that, then I had to guess which one he made after knowing Da Vinci.
Right.
I'd obviously choose this one.
Right. Although he made that one after knowing Leonardo's work as well, so that's a little more difficult. The landscape in this is, it doesn't have that sort of mysterious mood that Leonardo would give us in the same way, I think.
No, definitely not Leonardo, but more than this one, I guess.
Yeah, I can see that. Before I would say, yep, this is where, if you were doing a research project on this is where I would lead you, which is say, let's look at them all. Let's see what Raphael's we've got, and see if there's a trend or a direction, or if what we're seeing in this particular one might be accountable to something entirely different, right? Because I'm also seeing something slightly different in that, which would be too difficult to get into right now, right? But I see what you're talking about, right? It is a slightly more humid looking.
And the colors
Yeah.
just remind me of the landscape in
Yeah.
Mona Lisa.
I think the thing to do, Julie, we go home and do a Google image search for Raphael,
Okay.
right?
I'll add that to my homework list.
Yeah. And then report out. Tell us what you see, right? I don't have a good answer for it off the top of my head, right? Okay, where are we next? Why was Raphael brought to Rome? This is really behaving slowly. There we go. In addition to the Sistine ceiling, Julius had another major painting project that he wanted done for him. And this was a suite of rooms that Julius used for his private chambers, right? Called the papal apartments. Okay? Now they're not apartments like, you know, a 2-bedroom walk-up or something like that, right? This means that they're apart from the other areas, and it's not like there's a paper toilet or anything like that, right? But there's a series of 4 rooms that he used for official affairs, right? Papal apartments. And they're sort of just, I mean, literally right next door to the Sistine Chapel, right? Kind of on the other side of the wall almost from there. And Julius wants these frescoes as well, right? And Raphael gets started on them with the very first of the rooms, which is called the Stanza della Signatura, which means the room of the signatures. Okay? That's not hard to figure out. You don't need to know Italian to figure that one out, right? The room of the signatures. And what this was a library that he needed in order to devise papal proclamations, right? This is where he would sign official papal documents. And the library was there in case he needed to research anything, right? Look into stuff more fully. And so, and you see, by the way, in the floor there's keys. That's the sign of the Pope, right, in the tiles on the floor. Because St. Peter, the first Pope, was given the keys to heaven based on his proclamation of faith. So a key is always the symbol of St. Peter. Right? And you can see how big these frescoes are on the wall by the doorway. Here, you stand about like this tall, right? They're pretty monstrous. And you will never see this room empty. So we got a better slide here than you'll see in Rome if you ever go. Right? It's a zoo. Like the Vatican is just a zoo. Okay, so this is Raphael's big project. Are these 4 rooms, and this is the first one, the room of the signatures. And the frescoes on the 4 wall are allegories for the 4 parts of the papal library. Writings on law, writings on theology, poetry, which is to say sort of all narrative fiction, and philosophy, right? And each one of them symbolizes these pursuits by showing us figures who practiced them in history, right? And the most famous of these is the philosophy wall, which is known as the School of Athens, right? That's its nickname, the School of Athens. And what Raphael shows us here, and remember this is for the Pope, is all of the greatest philosophers from the ancient world gathered together on one stage, regardless of when they lived, right? So it's this massive assembly of ancient Greek, Roman, Persian philosophers miraculously gathered together in one place. You can tell that the composition is very balanced and centered on the 2 standing figures in the middle, one in red and one in blue. These are Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right, the 2 heaviest hitters from ancient Greek philosophy. And each of them carries one of their books, one of their most famous writings. And each of them also gestures toward the source of their study. Now, Plato, we've mentioned this before when we talked about Neoplatonism. Plato said that truth exists in metaphysics. It's not about the physical world, it's about the ideal in the human mind. So he points up, right? This is where we find truth, higher things, metaphysics. Aristotle believed that truth could be derived from closely studying the physical world. So he has his hand out like this, right? The world that you study. And the 2 of these figures are organizational principles for the rest of the composition. Everybody on Plato's side study metaphysics. Everybody on Aristotle's side study the physical world, right? So it separates around these two figures. And we don't have time to go look at them all, but there's Socrates. And in fact, you see the pug nose. This is based on Raphael's knowledge of ancient sculptures of Socrates, right? He had a sort of a standard portrait type, and that's exactly what he looked like in ancient Roman sculptures of Socrates, ancient Greek sculptures. And he's doing the Socratic method, right? He's numbering out his reasoning, and he's talking to the children of the young boys of Athens, which will be why eventually he has to die, right? So there's Socrates on the left. He was a pupil of Plato. He's with the metaphysics, right? On the other side, we have Ptolemy, who studies the earth, Zoroaster, who studies celestial bodies, right? So they're on the side of the earthly philosophers, the physical sciences, right? So for this, and this is true in the other images as well, in this room we have a gathering, right, of all of the greatest secular philosophers from ancient Rome. And keep in mind that the High Renaissance is this period when sort of Christian themes end up being almost supplanted by non-Christian themes, in particular ancient Roman themes, right? The birth of Venus, the battle of the 10 nude men, right? And here we see as well the Pope himself deeply immersed in ancient philosophy, non-Christian philosophy, as part of what he sees important, necessary to do his job, right? So while on one hand the subject matter of this is this gathering of all of the great minds of the ancient world, on another level the subject of this picture is really Pope Julius II. And the fresco and the details give honor to what Julius is doing in Rome at exactly this time. Look at the building where this takes place. We have a wall leading down to a sort of circular opening, and that barrel vault continues out from there. That's what St. Peter's looked like at this time, right? We saw this picture before. This is exactly what the Cathedral of St. Peter's looked like at this point in its development. So the School of Athens is being gathered not just any old place, it's being gathered in the Rome that Julius is building, right? The statues on the walls on either side, the one on the left in particular, looks very much like one of the figures that Michelangelo actually completes at this time for the tomb of Julius II, now being translated into this image of Apollo playing his lyre. Melissa.
Is there a pattern, like, is this pattern called anything on the inside dome? Like, we see a little close-up of it, like, they almost look like swastikas, but,
This one here?
yeah,
Meander pattern.
okay. Does that, like, mean anything, or is it just?
It comes from a study of Julian, something on this?
I just recognize it as what we call now a Greek key.
Because I think it was called Meander pattern in the Renaissance and also in ancient Greece. What is it? Does it mean anything other than another reflection of Raphael's ongoing study of ancient Rome, right? Ancient Greek artifacts. You find it often on the sides of pottery, right?
I've seen it in DC on the side of some buildings too, so.
Yeah, and it's this. If you follow it with your eye, right, it becomes this sort of maze-like pattern, right? You can follow the one line all the way through, and it definitely is a classical, a decorative pattern, right? I thought you were talking about the coffers in the ceiling, which look very much like remind us of things like Union Station, right? And Daniel Burnham was doing the same thing back in ancient Rome and Greece for his influences as well. So again, all these things that sort of specialize it, if you will, right? Personalize it for Pope Julius. And with that in mind, some of the figures here are also portraits of people that Julius had gathered around him. So while the Socrates is based on ancient sculptures, the figure of Apelles, who was the painter to Alexander the Great, the court painter to Alexander the Great, is a self-portrait of young Raphael. And by this point, he's roughly 30-ish or so, right? And this is the architect is working on St. Peter's. down here, Bramante, right? And if we go back to the legend that at one point Raphael snuck into the Sistine ceiling, right? And saw what Michelangelo was doing. People say that he added this figure of Michelangelo leaning on an uncut block of stone with that broken nose from the fist fight when he was a kid, right? And painted looking very much like a Michelangelo figure. And is not in any of the preparatory studies for this, right? A later afterthought in homage to Michelangelo after having seen the Sistine ceiling. So it's this incredible moment in history, right? Another of these, if you will. We had all three of these guys, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, in Florence at the same time, at least for a month, right? And now we have Raphael and Michelangelo both working for Pope Julius around 1510 in Rome. This is the apex of the High Renaissance, right? This is really the absolute fruition of this. And a lot of it comes because Pope Julius has got this vision, right? He wants to rebuild Rome. And we often think about the Renaissance in terms of the artists and the thinkers who are making these things, right? But really, it wouldn't have happened without Julius, right? We often forget him, right? How important the patronage of these works is in order to see these projects through. So if someone were to ask me who I thought the most important figure of the Renaissance is, I would say it's probably Julius. Because without Julius, you don't get the Sistine ceiling. Michelangelo's not going to go out and do that on his own, right? Without Julius, you don't get this. The School of Athens, right? Without Julius, you don't get the new building of St. Peter's. All of these monuments to the Renaissance. He's probably the single driving force behind it. Dies in 1513. Raphael dies age 37 in 1517. Leonardo dies in 1519. Pretty much the Renaissance is over at that point, right? Things change after that. And then the Reformation happens, right? In that same time frame. And that shakes up this, the power of the church in a way that's never really been solved since then. The power of the Catholic Church, right? So the Renaissance moment is really all but over by 1520 for all of these things that are happening around it. Okay. Now we have one other thing we need to look at as we're talking about Renaissance art. Let's see what's coming up next here. Bing, boom. I don't know why I have that twice, but I do. It's a really rotten slide. We need to look at one other city, which is Venice. Because when we trace the history of the Renaissance, what we find when we look at Venice is things kind of are different from what we've been used to seeing, right? So we look at next to Raphael, we think back to maybe things like Leonardo's Last Supper, right? There's a sense of balance, of symmetry, right? And it's kind of underscoring Renaissance art. And it kind of comes from the idea of using perspective, right? One-point perspective, which tends to make things symmetrical, right? Even all the way back to Masaccio, where Jesus is right in the middle, right? And everything kind of opens up around it. But if we look at Giorgione, who's working in Venice, look where the Holy Family is. They're ostensibly the focus of any nativity scene, or in this case, the shepherds adoring Jesus, but they're all the way off to the side. Right? They're not that pyramidal, perfected center of the composition. Right? It seems kind of a different kind of balance, right? Not a balance of symmetry, but a balance of asymmetry, right? And on a certain level, it makes not the Holy Family the main theme, but the shepherds, who do occupy the dead center of the composition, right? Coming now to worship Christ. And we think back to Duccio, right? With Duccio, we saw the Madonna and Child dead center. The shepherds were off to the left. This is exactly the opposite, right? We've moved in the opposite direction. Some nice details of this, right? So there's the Virgin Mary taking a moment to worship Christ. This comes from a later non-biblical source, the Visions of St. Bridget of Sweden. She talked about the fact that the Madonna took a moment to reflect on what was going to happen to Christ, and we see her praying to him. That is about the cutest baby Jesus we've seen yet as well. He's very good with infants. And I like Joseph's kind of figuring it out, with his hands trying to figure out, sort of, this is what I'm doing as well, right? And there's our ox and donkey in the background behind them, right? So this is off to the side, and the shepherds are coming in from the other side, and they too are sort of mirroring their actions on what they see in front of them. So one kneels, again prays, the other one takes off his hat, right? In honor to Christ as they've arrived now here. What's interesting about the Giorgione picture, and a lot of what we're going to see in Venetian painting, and I'm going to speed this up a bit because we don't have that many works to look at, is that in addition to the sort of asymmetry that comes out of the Venetian compositions, there's also a focus on weather, on atmosphere, and on the countryside, in a way that we don't see even in something like Leonardo, who's interested in all that stuff. So with the shepherds here in the foreground and the landscape that opens up behind them, what we end up seeing with this is a focus on sort of country life, if you will. Taking up almost half of the image is this landscape where we see them, more shepherds behind them, people, a guy in the hut on the left, some people by the shoreline, ghostly behind them still, and the sort of rustic, destroyed architecture back there fulfilling the landscape. And this is a hallmark of a lot of Venetian pictures, is this interest in the countryside. And we find it also in poetry produced in Venice at exactly the same time. There's a great interest in the landscape. And that's kind of fascinating because Venice doesn't have landscape. Venice is an island. Venice is a completely developed series of small islands. There are no green spaces in Venice, or very, very few. Most of them are private gardens, right? Venice is lagoons. Venice is canals, right? Venice is paved. Pretty much everywhere, except for the canals. They don't have stretches of green land. So these works that immerse us in dry land, in earthly landscapes, had a particular appeal to people from Venice. And we find this interest not only in poetry but in painting, of a poetic kind of landscape that is about the beauties of wandering out in the countryside and finding in that a sort of mysterious poetry. I want to look at some details of this. I'll see what's coming up insofar as the sequence of things, right? Nice detail of the background where we can see we're actually away from the city, right? There's a city back there behind the trees, and we are withdrawn from that. And we have this ruined tower. Again, ruins are a strong metaphor for the birth of Christ, right? Things are broken, need some fixing, right? We saw that with Jan van Eyck. But also you'll notice that this tower establishes a fall of light. That there's a very low light coming across the horizon, right? It's sunset, basically, right? Lighting up the bottoms of those clouds. You can see some of the yellow in the distant horizon here, right? But hitting the side of the building like this, right? Horizontally. And directly next to that, we see another light through this archway. These are earthly lights, right? Natural light, if you will. And you'll notice that the fall of light in the background, this little torch here, is different from the pools of light that fall on the shepherds. But they seem to be lit from up here, right? So what Giorgione is doing in a much more naturalistic way is the same sort of thing that we saw with the Marode picture by Campin, where earthly light and heavenly light, right? There's a juxtaposition between the two. In this case, the heavenly light is what's falling on the foreground. That's illuminating the shepherds. They're casting a shadow on Jesus, right? Because it's coming from over their shoulders. It's not the same light that illuminates the landscape, right? That's earthly light. This is heavenly light in the foreground. Right? So he's using the natural details to pick out sort of certain religious themes that we've seen elsewhere. Now, what's interesting, as we back away a little bit, is we see that there are these two shepherds in the middle distance here, and they're looking up here. And you'll notice that the light that's shining on us also hits the front of that tree. Right? So they're looking at the light source. They're looking at the heavenly light source. And lo and behold, what's up there? Right? There's the angel, right, coming from heaven, illuminating these trees. So there's this recognition of the heavenly light source in the upper corner. Right? So what Giorgione is doing is using the landscape to add to the symbolism. Using the landscape to sort of bring in very traditional ideas that we've seen in other pictures, but doing it through landscape, right? And as he worked on the picture, he originally planned to have this cliff be a bit further out, and he kept pushing it backwards. You notice the x-rays, that as he worked, he kept opening up more and more of the landscape background in order to allow it to dominate the composition. Right? Got that? So this relates directly to the most prominent kind of writing that we find from Venice at the time, which are what are called pastoral poems. Poems that focus on the rustic, rural landscape. Right? The countryside that's been unspoiled by human progress. And these Venetian poems, pastoral means shepherds, right? Pastors are shepherds. Pastoral poems are based on a study of ancient Roman poetry. Poets like Ovid, who wrote about shepherds living in the landscape as the alternative to the crazy, busy life in the city. So they're reviving that as part of their Renaissance. That interest in the rural world as a perfect antidote to the world we live in. And in ancient literature, when we find these poems, they're set in a place called Arcadia. And Arcadia was, in Greek mythology, a rural landscape where time stood still, where no one aged, where death didn't exist, which made it the perfect place to go. So this landscape, this image, this adoration of the shepherds is put forth to us, as the poems are, as a place where we can take refuge from the cares of the world around us, particularly in a very urban environment like Venice, a particularly urban environment, right? We can take a sort of visual vacation from it. And this is something that's really attractive to people. It still is, right? Why bother to go camping? Right? What's the joy of pitching a tent and starting a fire? Is that you want to get away from this sort of normal day-to-day urban BS that we put up with all the time, right? And you want to have a cycle of life that's closer and more in harmony with, you get up when the sun gets up and you go to bed when the sun goes down, right? And you turn off the cell phone, right? And you don't have people knocking on your door. There's something really kind of wonderful about that, about feeling that you're getting something that's important and spiritually reviving by getting away from the normal day. So in a place like Venice, this was particularly attractive, right? Given what we know about Venice, and I guess here's our good last slide. There's an aerial view of Venice. If you don't know, right? Venice is in a lagoon. It's a series of islands that are connected, right, and paved over, basically, with the canals as the principal mode of transportation. But the only way to get to Venice was in the 15th century by boat. Right now, there's a viaduct that connects it, right? But it's isolated from the land, and that's part of what made paintings like this so popular in Venice in the Renaissance. Okay, we'll wrap up Renaissance Venice on whatever the next day was, Tuesday, and move to the north. I'll have a better idea then about where we're headed and how far we're going to get. But the bottom line is that I'm sure we're not going to get to mannerism before the midterm. Okay? So as you're budgeting your weekend, don't bother with mannerism yet. Right?
paintings Michelangelo did of women.
Mm-hmm.
Could that have been a result of, this is a Shakespearean time, you know, where male actors play female?
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
You know, I'm assuming that, especially.
No, they would have. They would have had opportunity to see the female model. I think it has to do with the idea, the degree to which Michelangelo believes very strongly that the human form, and in his mind it's the male human form, communicates this meaning of what the human spirit is really all about.
Okay, so
Right.
it's just going back to women sort of being.
But I like the idea that of Shakespearean act. Shakespeare's 100 years later, right? He's 1600.
So that would even be more
But
progressive.
that's right. That's right. I hadn't thought about that, and I don't know the degree to which female models were taboo. I don't know that.
Because in the, sorry to interrupt, but in the prior works, the